Hello, everyone. As you may know, my name is Daniel Pataki, and yes, I write for Smash Magazine and WPMU Dev and Tuts Plus and other places like that. I also, yes, I was in a band. I played the triangle. And today I'm here to talk about advanced custom fields. I don't know if you know this plugin. Perhaps you can put up your hands if you've ever used it. Oh, great. OK. Advanced custom fields is, it basically replaces the functionality that WordPress has now for custom fields. So before I go into advanced custom fields, let me show you the state of affairs right now. So what's happening now with custom fields is it's basically a key value pair that you can add. This works fine sometimes. If you want to indicate your mood when you wrote a post, for example, you can type in mood to the key, and you can type in happy for the value. And then right there, there's a problem, because whenever you type things in, you're going to make typos. So if you mistype happy and you use 1p, for example, your application may break a little bit, but not enough to cause problems, because what you may do in the front end is create a filter that would show you all the posts when you were happy. Now, if you have 100 posts and 2 are missing, no one will notice. However, if you're making an application which creates data points and you type 100 instead of 1,000, you may have much bigger problems. There are also user interface issues. There could be instances where if you need to give a location, like in the background there, you have 2 choices. You can say location for the key, and then add a latitude and a longitude as, let's say, comma-separated values. That's fine if you're used to it, but users will get it wrong. They're going to use semicolons, they're going to use dashes, they're going to add spaces. It's going to be a documentation nightmare. Even if you document it, people will get it wrong. The other way to go is to add latitude and longitude separately. Again, a bit of a problem. It's very obvious that this was made for programmers and not users. I'm fine with using serialized arrays and pasting them in places, but I make errors just like anyone else, so it's not great. What advanced custom fields does is expand on this quite a bit, and your custom fields will look like that instead. It gives you field types primarily, and it's much more user-friendly. As you can see from the location field, it's not just the latitude-longitude pair. It's an actual map, which you can use to create a location. And in the background, it does actually save a latitude and a longitude, but it's much easier to use. A user looks at that and immediately sees what has to be done. So it's much more user-friendly. And as you can see, there are many, many fields. There's a radio button field there. There's an email field. There's a file field. And there are other complex JS-based controls like the map. Like, for example, there's a date picker, a color picker. There's a what you see is what you get editor, and so on. And it's obvious that it also has error checking. Once you get to making field types like the email field, you can go ahead and check if it's an actual email, so users won't be able to save data that's not in its place. And it's very obvious that this was made for programmers and for users, which is the best case scenario because you're including both sides of the equation. So this is what it would actually look like in context. So as you can see, it's irregular. It fits right into the post interface. And it's basically a joy to use for programmers and users alike. So I also wanted to mention what ACF does so well, because on the surface it's pretty obvious, but there are some other issues which aren't that obvious. So first of all, I've talked about usability and clarity. But one of my favorite things that it achieves is better communication, and that's not that obvious when you just start using it. It gives you a great tool to communicate with your clients, because clients won't understand key value pairs, and even if they do, they're not going to want to enter key value pairs. So instead of talking to them abstractly or maybe creating briefs and stuff, you can actually create the options very, very quickly and show them what it will look like and show them the data needs for the application. And it actually does go both ways. I have had people coming to me showing me what they want. And that was great because we didn't need to go back and forth. They could actually set up their own options. And all I needed to worry about was creating the front end for it and making sure that the data entry works and is recorded in the database properly. So it's a great way to communicate with people, and even within your team, it makes everything much easier. There's also faster and easier coding involved. The fastness is pretty obvious because you don't actually need to code the fields yourself. But it's also easier to code because there are standard functions for bringing out the values of fields, for manipulating the values, there are filters, and so on. It standardizes inputs across screens, and this is something which a few years ago I as a developer would have killed for. What you can do is not only add custom fields into posts, but you can also add them to user edit screens, you can add them to taxonomy screens, you can add them to attachment screens. Basically, anywhere users enter options or enter values, you can add these fields and they will look and act the same. This is invaluable for creating a proper application for your clients, making sure that whenever they see a field, they work in a familiar way. It also exposes the CMS aspect of WordPress, which is sorely needed, I think, because WordPress has been much more than a blogging platform for a while now, and it's not very immediately obvious to clients that this is so. They get a glimpse into how you can actually use it as a database for yourself. Even if you don't code, you can actually use it as a proper diary, for example. You can create your posts, and then you can add any sort of data that you want, like what the weather was like. You don't necessarily have to display it, but the data is there. And that's also a great power of ACF, because what happens is you can create all this data and be sure that you're going to be able to implement it at some point in the front end. It's also a pretty good learning tool. It's coded very, very well. It doesn't always follow WordPress standards for code formatting, for example, but the ethos in which it was created, the way that it was coded, is very much WordPress-centric. For example, the two functions we'll be looking at will be the field and get field. And if you've ever created a template, these will be obvious what they do. It also showcases what WordPress is capable of. This is more for programmers, because the reason ACF is so powerful is, for one reason, is that it's very well coded, but the other reason is that WordPress actually allows this power to be added to itself. It had a system which worked okay, and then it gave someone the power to create a plugin which can integrate so well. And last of all, I've talked about this, so this is kind of an aggregate thing. It empowers users to do a lot more and to see what's going to happen, and the fact that they can enter basically any data that they want. So how do you work with ACF? ACF is built around field groups and fields. So what you do is you create field groups, and these are groups that you will eventually assign to the user edit screen, the post edit screen, and so on. So you can create a field group for user options, for example. Then you can start adding fields, and this one has 6 fields, and it for various field types and various data. And you can see how it would look on the back end of WordPress. You can see all the fields represented there, except one of them, which is a conditional field, which I'll tell you about in a second. So once you add a field, a single field, each field has loads of options. This is an example for a location field, and it has a number of things that you can set up. As you can see, it has some default options like the field type, the field name, the description, and so on, and whether or not it's required. These options are shared across all fields, so these are the same whatever field type you add. And then there are some options which are for specific fields. For example, the location one, you can give a default latitude and longitude that you want the map to go to, a default zoom level, and a default height. So this is very powerful for setting up to make sure that your fields work for your clients properly or for yourself properly. When you get to actually using the fields, when you have a complete field group ready, you can place this field group wherever. This is conditional fields. Sorry, I have very bad eyesight. The last thing in the fields section is conditional fields, which is a very powerful way to make sure that only those fields that you want people to see show up. So, for example, I had an option there which was, does this user want to be included in the newsletter? And there was also another option, which is the newsletter email address for that user. So I can make sure that if the user has ticked the newsletter box, then the other field shows up, the email field. And if the user has not ticked the box, the field doesn't show up at all. This increases clarity, and declutters the interface, and it makes everything great all around. One thing, though, is to be careful with this functionality a bit. You don't want multiple things disappearing and reappearing all the time. So don't go overboard with it. But as long as you have simple options and you've built it logically, it should be fine. Right, so finally we get to locations. Locations allow you to put your field wherever you want. And again, there's a lot of power in here. It's as simple as setting it up, but it's not as simple as just putting it somewhere. You can add a lot of complex rules. Like, for example, I want to make sure that this shows up in the user edit screen, but I also want to make sure that only users who are logged in as admins can see. And this allows you to pretty tightly control who has access to what and who needs access to what. So for more sensitive options, you might want only admins to be able to change them, so you can set it up really easily. And these are 3 examples of where you can put fields. On the far left, you can see an example of an attachment page, and you can see the fields at the bottom there. Then you also have the user edit screen, and then you have a taxonomy screen, and even fields like the file editor or the file adder and location fields, they all work in all these locations. So how to specifically work with ACF, once you have all the options in and once you've added all your data, there are lots and lots of functions. However, you essentially only need to know two, which is the field and get field, and maybe get field object, which I'll talk about in a second. So if you're familiar with themes, you know that when it's prefixed with the, a function will probably echo stuff back to you. When it's prefixed with get, it will probably return things back to you. So indeed, it is so in this case as well. When you retrieve the value of a field, you can use the field to echo it or get field to return it. Get field object is used when you want the whole field, the object, which includes all the options that it has. It does include the value, but it completely describes the whole field. You may want to use this sometimes when creating complex controls on the front end as well. So this is an example of a quick implementation from the 2015 theme. It's basically a restaurant with 3 custom fields. One custom field allows me to add a contact email. The second one allows me to add a menu, which is in a PDF form. And then the third one gives a location. And you can see the code on top. That's all that's needed to create those 2 links. So it's basically a paragraph with 2 links in it. And I just use the field and use the field name to pull that field out. The bottom part seems more complex, but that's only because there's Google Maps code in there. So all you need to know is that I used get field there because you can echo the value of that field, but it's going to be a larger string which contains the latitude, the longitude, and the address. So it's better to get that field because it gives you an array which contains all this data, and then you can use it as you wish. For example, adding it to Google Maps to make sure that it displays the location. Aside from this, there are tons and tons of developer features that developers will love. There's an import-export feature which is extremely powerful. What you can do is export all your options into a default WordPress export file, and it actually imports all your fields with the default WordPress importer. So you can save and you can share all these fields in whatever way you like. The second option is to export all your fields in actual PHP code, which allows you to include these fields programmatically in themes and plugins. So if you create a plugin, ACF actually has the option of hiding itself. So if you don't want people to see the interface, you can hide the interface altogether. But even if you keep it there, if you've added the fields programmatically, users will not see those fields. So if you have application settings, they will be available in the user section or post fields or wherever, but they won't actually see the field groups and the fields in the ACF interface. It also has WordPress standard code, as I've talked about, pretty much like 95%. And it also has an object-oriented nature, pretty much, which allows you to learn that type of programming as well. It has great documentation, not just on its website, but inline in the code. There's a lot you can learn. Everything is documented, especially when you get to custom field creation, because what you can do is you can create your own custom field types. For example, I've created, I think it's 6 now in the repository. I've created one for Google font selection. It pulls in all the Google fonts from the API and allows you to select fonts, and then the post can use that. So, so you can create these field types for yourself or for your clients, whichever one you need. And ACF provides a template for this. You download the template and you basically modify it to create the field that you need. And if you're not a developer or you're just starting out, this is much less scary than you think. There's so much documentation in the actual template, you'll probably just be copy-pasting things. It's really easy. And also there are plenty of filters and actions, which is great if you want to modify the behavior of what it does. For example, you can modify the data that gets saved to the database before it's saved. You can modify it after it's retrieved from the database and output to the API. So it's very, very powerful. I just want to show you a quick further examples of what it can do. This is an example for attachment options. And what you can do is set up your fields and create something like this, which allows you to add some text options, but the main thing is the color options there. You can create a color picker, and this has been done with a repeater field, which is actually a premium thing, but it allows you to multiply fields so you can add more and more of them. So I chose 3 colors, and then on the front end, you can actually use a very little bit of code to actually output these fields. So you can see all the colors there, and I don't know off the top of my head, but I'm pretty sure there are scripts from actually parsing colors out of photos. So you could do the whole thing actually programmatically. You may not even need ACF for it. There are also larger scale API integrations that you can do. So I worked on a project recently where we have webinars, and what we want people to do is sign up for these webinars. And when they do, they get signed up to a newsletter automatically. And also, each webinar is on a different topic, and we may have a newsletter on that topic specifically as well. So what happens is in the WordPress backend, the editor or the administrator creates a webinar, and then they can select a newsletter list that they also want to add the user to. And this newsletter list actually comes from MadMimi, which is a newsletter application. It's like MailChimp. So it pulls the data live from the API, and it allows users to actually choose from an actual MadMimi list. And what happens is there's the field on top, and with very little code, we can parse out the field value, which is one of the newsletters, and then we can actually use the MadMimi API with a one-liner thing to add that user to the newsletter. And then they show up in MadMimi. So it's extremely powerful, and it's achieved with very little code. Now, there is an ACF Pro version, and I'm not affiliated with ACF at all, but this has made my life so much easier that this is one of the rare things that I actually do advise looking into. It gives you 4 additional fields. The best one of them is the repeater and the gallery, maybe. The repeater allows you to create these multiple fields where you not only select one color, but you can select another and another and another. And it allows for more complex controls. For example, a very frequent use case is for theme builders who have, in the header, you might have some links, and the links may take the form of an icon and then some text. And the way they usually do that is they allow for maybe 5 of these. But what you can do with ACF, you can build a repeater field, which contains an image, it contains a link, and then some link text. And if you make this a repeater field, the user can just add as many of these as they want. Then in the code, you can loop through these and just display all of them in the header. It makes the backend so much easier. The gallery field allows you to create a gallery. The flexible content field kind of allows you to make a content builder. I don't really use that much myself. And then there's an options page option, which allows you to populate your fields into an options page, which is super helpful when you have a plugin. There are 2 versions of it. One is a $25 version, and it allows you to create one site with it. But the unlimited version is $100, and it is very well worth it because you can use it in unlimited projects. And it is also a good way to support the developer. Actually, I do have a quick promotion. So I have 3 of these unlimited licenses available. So if the first 3 people who can tweet something awesome to me will definitely be able to get one, I can hook you up with the creator if you'd like. So basically, that was all I have to say about ACF, apart from the fact that this is the plugin that has made my life the simplest so far. I really like this plugin because it's just an example of what plugins can and should be. You do see simple plugins being very good, but it's very rare that you see something as complex as this being so well built out. And it's not that obvious based on the screenshots. If you actually try it out, you'll see why it works so well, because it's all built with JavaScript. And all these options, when you add all your fields, it's actually all JavaScript, so you don't need to go between screens. Like when you add a field, you don't need to save it and so on. When you expand a field to add the options, there's no need to save it. There's no other screen. So it works very, very well. Even things like the conditional field, where you would create a field and then another field based on the value of that field, you can just create those things continuously. Everything is updated with JavaScript in the backend. You just need to click publish at the end. So if you have any questions, I would recommend you ask them now because I have to leave soon. So if you don't ask those questions, you can get to me via Twitter, or you can reach me at my email address. If you have any questions at all about this or about the workshop that was yesterday, just drop me a line and I'll be happy to answer you. That's it. Thank you. Yes.
Oui.
You can just shout.
Yeah.
Try again. You probably have to switch it to on.
I'll use it for the... Okay, that's great. Can you implement it in theme, or you have to use it always as a plugin?
No, you can implement it in a theme and a plugin without actually having the plugin installed. So what you can do is ACF has a way that it can include itself in your code without having the plugin installed. So if you have any plugin or any theme, you can include the whole code in the plugin. And actually, that reminds me, I forgot to say that ACF has a lot of extensions to it. So if you want some fields that you need, you don't necessarily have to make them for yourself. There are lots and lots of plugins already available in the repository. Yes?
Hi.
How much overhead does it makes to post stable meta tables? It adds another key value pair to the original.
None. Well, that's not completely true. It adds overhead, but the databases don't crash because there's a lot of information in them. So whether you have 100 rows or a million rows, it doesn't much matter. What matters is how you retrieve those rows. And that is done very well. So ACF, it works almost exactly like the key value pairs work for custom fields. So it uses meta tables and options, but it does add 2 rows per each option. And the reason this is needed is that I believe if you have a lot of field groups and you have fields which are named the same way, so you have an image field which you've actually named image, and you have those in multiple field groups, I believe that's the reason that there's actually a field key as well, which identifies the field. This is not much of an overhead. In fact, it probably reduces the overhead because fields can be looked up more easily.
More questions? Well, was there a hand there? Yeah. Oh.
Just give me a second. There is a question on Twitter.
Cool.
So, how does ACF compares to other similar plugins, in your opinion? For example, types.
I've not used types before, but before I started using ACF, I did try and write kind of my own, and I did try a few plugins at the time. I can't remember what their names were, but there's no comparison that I've seen so far. I haven't tried that plugin, so I don't know. But I have not seen a plugin which even approaches the quality, especially if you look into the code quality that's behind it. It's really easy to use, and it actually works on the code side as well very well.
And what do you think about the user interface of the ACF? Could it be better, maybe, in some way?
Definitely. There's always room to improve stuff.
Is there a way maybe to make it different for the designers?
Well, yes and no. There are lots of actions and hooks built into it. So there are hooks which allow you to add scripts and manage the head stuff. So yes, there is. There's no specific mechanism put into place for adding your own CSS file, for example. But since it uses so many hooks and so many actions and filters, you can do it pretty easily yourself if you're familiar with using hooks and filters. Yes.
Okay. I think that's all. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you.